So, you want to just say your name and where you were born?
Brenda Crawford, born in Jackson, Mississippi. I'm 75 years old, soon to be 75, later this year. And I am blessed and highly favored. Have lived a life of activism for the last 40 some odd years. Had a stroke recently and am recovering from a stroke, but even during those times I have been blessed because only, I think it's like 30 or 40% of the people who have the kind of stroke that I had survived. And as you can see, I'm still here and kicking. So, glad to be here. Thank you, Anna, for doing this. Well, I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, but and I certainly, with my age, I grew up in the segregated South. My grandmother raised me. My mom and I grew older together because my mom had me when she was 16. So as I was growing up, she was not only my mother, but she was my best friend because she was so young. And in the segregated South, I went to segregated schools. My grandmother, who raised me, used to prepare meals for the Freedom Riders who would come down south, and there would be young people, a lot of them young Jewish people. That's why I have this unshakable commitment to the Jewish community, because very few people know what part Jews played in the civil rights movement, and it was great. So my grandmother used to cook for the Freedom Riders at her church called Clark Street Missionary Baptist Church, and I met a lot of young folks who were social justice activists, and that only gave me the incentive as I got older to do the same thing. And I've done that for, as I said, 40 years. And continue to do whatever I can at the age of 75, soon to be. I'm now working with older lesbians, trying to make sure that we don't lose our relevancy and we don't leave all of our rich history behind. And we hand over our legacy to younger lesbians of all color who are coming up. So,
what was school like?
What was school like?
Yeah.
Well, I grew up in the segregated South, so I went to an all-black school, and of course we did not have the same sort of resources that white kids had. So, I mean, it was, even instead of that, I think even though that happened and that we didn't have the same kind of resources that white kids had, we had wonderful teachers. I still remember my
Do you remember their names?
I do.
Yeah.
I remember
what were their
my
names?
teacher, Mrs. Nelson.
Uh-huh.
I come from a family of teachers. My aunt was named Matilda Barney, and her other sister were Janie Barney, and they were teachers in the Jackson public school system, Jackson, Mississippi public school system. And so I went to school with my aunt. I went to the same school that my aunts taught in. And in fact, my Aunt Matilda has an endowed chair at Jackson State University.
Oh. What was her last name?
Barney.
The Matilda Barney Endowed Chair.
Right, in Jackson, Mississippi. So, so I grew up with educators, and my grandmother, who raised me, was a traveling school teacher. They used to have those. Where she would go from plantation to plantation to teach African American farm workers. Wow. During the off season.
I didn't. Wow.
So young black men and women had to work in the cotton fields during the summer, and then in the fall they would go to school, usually in these one-room schoolhouses. That some people in the community had built for African American students, and my grandmother would travel around from plantation to plantation teaching kids. She often talked about those stories of teaching farm boys who were older than her and who were certainly a lot bigger because my grandmother was a short woman. I come from a tribe of short women who have
Only
small,
in height.
yeah,
Yeah.
small and mighty, but small in stature but mighty in spirit. And so she would tell me stories about trying to teach these farm boys and get them to behave with her little self. But she was a mighty woman. So I come from a long line of black community activists.
Do you know where she went to? Do you know like where she went to school? How she got her teacher's certificate, or how much?
Well, during that time, you did not have to have a college degree to teach, be a traveling school teacher. You had to have a high school diploma and a teaching certificate from a test that they would give traveling teachers. And so my grandmother was one of the first ones who took.
She's probably like 15 or 16.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my grandmother was one of the first people who took the teacher's test in Mississippi at the time when they had that. She later went on to Jackson State University, where my aunts have the endowed chair. She never finished, but she did later on in life go to college, and she stopped being a traveling school teacher when that system was no longer legitimate in Mississippi, when they developed public school systems, and so and required the teachers have a college degree, and my grandmother never had one. But then she went on to work the rest of her life as a food service supervisor in the Jackson public school system, where she would supervise cafeteria workers who were working in black schools. So I come from, as I said, a long line of social justice activists. My mother, who was just absolutely...
Mother Aura.
Yeah, Mother Aura, who was absolutely the love of my life. Later in her life, she started a nursing home ministry where she would go into the nursing homes all around this little town on Long Island, bringing comfort to people who were in nursing homes. And my mother later became the mother of the Church of God in Christ, her local church in Amityville, and she was a great believer. And since I've had my stroke, I've actually had dreams about my mom coming back because I was her pride and joy, and she was my pride and joy. And I miss her terribly, particularly now that I'm getting older and getting closer to going home to be with her. I really miss her. So, I've lived a really rich life. I've had a really rich life. Born and bred in Mississippi, now living in Vallejo, California. I came out before Stonewall, before the women's movement. Was active not active, but I remember the Stonewall riots. I remember riding the subway riding the Long Island train from Amityville to New York and going to Stonewall and seeing folks out in the streets and trying to figure out what was going on, and then figured out that it was because of police harassment. The police have a terrible record of harassing gays and lesbians back in the late 50s, early 60s. Our civil rights were not protected, nor were we respected, and we could get arrested. I remember one day walking down the street with my girlfriend at the time. I think I was like 17, and we were walking down the street, and she had my arm, and people yelling out of the window, queer, and just horrible things. So, after having lived through all of that, it was only natural that for the rest of my life I would fight for LGBT visibility. And now that I'm older, I'm fighting for LGBT seniors to have a full quality of life, because the chances that we will be married or have a dedicated partner like I have, who has been my partner for the last 20 years, is very rare. Most of us will age in isolation and alone. That's why groups like ZAMI Nobler, National Organization for Black Lesbian Aging, is so important. That's why Olaf, Old Lesbians Organized for Political Action, is so important, that we all mobilize to keep the folks who paved the way for us, keep our legacy alive, and keep doing the work that needs to be done. There is so much work still needs to be done here.
And you've so done it, Brenda. I just gotta cut you off for a minute. And I know you worry about this somewhat too, but you've so had an influence. You have your generation. I mean, they're heroes, heroines.
Yeah. I do worry about it. I worry that young folks don't realize the road that we've traveled and what a painful road it's been.
Yeah.
And that we did the fight so that they could be free.
Yeah.
They could be free to express their love in any way that they wanted to. And I get kind of emotional about it because back in the day, it was never comfortable to be a black lesbian in the black community. I've always fought to keep my foot in the black community and refused to let anybody tell me that my sexual orientation made me less than. I remember I was on a TV show in Oakland maybe 20 years ago, and I said that the black church would not have any musicians, would not have any ushers if the black LGBT community deserted the black mainstream church. And God, did I get hell for that? But it's true. We've always played a role in the black church. As I get older, I want to go back to the black church, but I refuse to go to any church where the minister is going to say, it was Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. I can't tolerate that kind of nonsense. And Jesus Christ never said anything about lesbians or gays. It was, I don't even remember that passage in the Bible talking about it's an abomination for a man to lay down with a man as he would with a woman, or for a woman. I don't even know if they say woman. I think
they don't, because that's like not the real world. I know you were really close to your grandfather, your pop.
Yeah.
What was his name?
Booker Taylor.
Booker Taylor? Oh,
Booker Taylor Jr.
Where was he born?
He was born in a little town in the Mississippi Delta called Vaughn, Mississippi.
Vaughn, Mississippi. And so, what year would that have been?
Oh my God!
Like
1908 or something.
1908.
I don't know, long time ago. I'd have to look that up.
Yeah.
I don't remember. But my grandfather was born on a sharecropper farm, and he and his family were sharecroppers for many, many years. And then he left the Mississippi Delta, and he went to work on the railroad, the Illinois Pacific Railroad, I think, or one of those railroads. He went to work on the railroad, laying railroad tracks. I mean, he wasn't a Pullman car porter or anything. He was a laborer on the railroad. And he worked there for many, many years. And then he worked there for probably over 20 years. And then when he got retirement, he was still young enough to go to work again to another place. And then he went to work in General Motors. And he worked in General Motors for over 20 years.
Was he unionized?
Yeah, he was
unionized.
Okay. Yeah, my grandfather was a shop steward for the union. Yeah. My
Which union was it?
The American Automobile Association.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
My grandfather was 100% union. I tell everybody he's rolling over in his grave because I haven't had an American car for years, And before I leave, Daddy, I'm going to buy a Chevrolet or a Buick.
Yeah, wow. So he was a shop steward, African American man. That in the
Yeah. So he worked for GM in Saginaw, Michigan, which I used to spend my summers in Saginaw. By that time, my mom had moved to a little town on Long Island called Amityville, and I would go and spend the summers with my grandparents in Saginaw, Michigan.
And you went to spend your summers with your grandparents in Mississippi too, right? So,
right.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but in Mississippi as well. So, yeah, finally my grandmother and my grandfather who moved to Saginaw, moved back to Jackson, Mississippi, moved back to their hometown. They're both buried in a graveyard that I'm going to go visit next year called Forest Lawn Cemetery.
I'm gonna go tell them that you're on your way when I go there in February.
Okay,
I
good.
sure will.
Go look up Matilda Barney, James Barney, Booker Taylor, and Annie Taylor. Go look them up and tell them that I am on my way to see them for one last time before I go to join them. I don't know why I'm getting so emotional talking about this, but I've had a rich life. I've had a very, very rich life. Despite all of the discrimination for being an openly black lesbian in the 60s, my life has been incredibly rich. I've made good friends like you, Anna, who has stuck by me through thick and thin. Fine.
So one of your teachers was Mrs. Nelson. Was it Mrs. Nelson or Miss Nelson?
Mrs. Nelson.
Okay, because that's one of the things. Like white teachers had to stop when they got married, but
Right.
yeah.
And Mrs. Nelson was killed by her husband in a domestic violence.
Oh, so how old were you when that happened?
Probably 12, maybe.
And so did they try and so kids just find stuff out?
Yeah, they, and I guess now that we're talking about it, maybe that's why my commitment to erase domestic violence is so strong. Maybe so.
So did you guys did your family get the Defender?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. The Defender. See, I'm sort of like Vallejo. Let's go back to.
Right.
So it must have been something that you all. So did you have relatives? See, one of the things, like with the Defender, I mean, like the people on the railroad, they distribute it and get subscriptions.
Right.
So did you get where did you get it? Was it coming in from different sources or?
It was coming in from different sources, but I remember my grandfather always bringing it.
Yeah.
Home. Yeah. So I grew up with that as well. There's so much rich history that we have in this country that we need to tap into.
Do you remember the names of kids you played with?
Yeah, my best friend was a woman named Loretta Whiting, and her family owned the local grocery store, corner store in my town. And my grandmother had an account up there because she worked long hours. So when I would come home, there would be nobody home. And so my grandmother would leave money up at this corner store for them to make me a sandwich when I came home.
What kind of sandwich?
There was a bologna sandwich. Always a bologna
Yeah.
sandwich. A bologna sandwich and a bottle of knee-high orange soda.
You had a bottle of soda every day?
Yeah, I did.
That is nice.
I know, that's partly why I'm addicted to sugar, but
Yeah, but still, it would have been a real treat.
Yeah, it was. And my grandmother always made sure that I knew I was special. From having a charge account at the local corner store when I was like 7, 8, 9, 10, that I could go in there and get anything I wanted. And
when you talk about that era too, I mean, just think about the fact you can how long a walk was it from your home to the school? To the store?
Probably a couple of blocks.
Yeah.
It was a corner store. It's
yeah,
called.
You can send your kids to the corner store. And,
yeah, I have some pictures of that store.
Oh, I'd love to see it. Yeah.
On my Facebook page.
Oh,
the last time I went to Mississippi, the
Okay.
store was still open, and my friend Loretta, whose parents opened that store, was still operating it.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
That's
so
amazing.
that was probably 8, 9 years ago, maybe.
So what were some
Before
games that you played?
we played hopscotch.
Hopscotch.
Jacks.
Oh.
I was really good at jacks.
God, they had jacks when I was a kid. You never.
Double dutch as well.
So when
I was never that good at it, but there were kids in the neighborhood who were double dutch champions.
So when you were a kid, you were probably pretty young when you started feeling, being gay or feeling. Kids know. In my experience, kids know pretty young.
Yeah, I mean, I knew when I had crush on my best friend, Loretta Whiting. And you know, kids are sexually curious at that time.
Yeah.
Too. And one day, her mom came in and found us in bed together. Now I don't know what we were doing. I think we were just laying there.
Yeah.
But I found out very early on that whatever we were doing, we were not supposed to be doing.
Were you frustrated about, like, consciously frustrated about stuff like having to do with, like, boys do this, girls do that?
Yeah, I was. I remember I was never really into the boy scene, although, you know, I mean, there wasn't much alternative. When I found out about Stonewall, as I said, I got on the Long Island train and rode to New York City, Greenwich Village, got the subway in New York and rode to Greenwich
How
Village.
did you find out about it?
I don't know. I don't know.
Did you hear about it from friends, maybe?
Maybe.
Yeah.
But I heard that there was a place that people like me hung out.
Wow.
So I got on the Long Island train, rode there by myself, got into Penn Station, got on the subway, and went up to Greenwich Village.
Okay, so Pico, whoever's editing this,
That I could not be the only one.
Yeah.
I could not be the only same gender loving woman. The first, I went to a Daughters of Bilitis meeting. You know, it was incredible. I went to my first Daughter of Bilitis meeting. Bilitis, it was
I always thought it was Bilitis, but I could be wrong.
Okay, I don't.
Yeah.
I may be mispronouncing it. But anyway, I went to my first meeting, and it was up in some woman's apartment in New York. And I walked in, and there were all of these white women with these tweed suits on and these sensible shoes.
Man, this is going to be the subject of like a couple segments of the oral history audience, just so you know.
There were these white women with these suits on and these walking shoes, and they all looked like, nobody looked like me, let me say that. And so I walked in, and I automatically knew that I did not belong there, because I kept talking about how did you come out, and most of these women were not out. They were dead up in the closet, and it was kind of like a secret society.
And so were they? I mean, I would think like were they like giving you looks and
they
stuff?
Were giving me giving me looks because I was black, and they were also giving me looks because at that time I was 100% butch. You know, I kind of dressed like a young tomboy, you know, and they were giving me looks, I think, because of racial and because of how I chose to dress and how I chose to live in the world. You know?
And you had what job were you working at the time?
I think I was working at the hospital. I was a occupational therapist aide at a hospital on Long Island called Fair Oaks, and
you were still real young then.
I was young, yeah,
like 20 or
something like that. Yeah, I moved out of my mom's house when I was 17 or 18.
Yeah.
My sister and we moved into a house where we had 2 bedrooms and use of the kitchen. And we lived there for a long time. And then I never went back to my mother's house. I think my sister did. And shortly after that, I decided to move into New York City. And I lived on Riverside Drive with the first woman who was my partner. Her name was Dr. Olivia Pearl Stokes. Okay. We met at, I can't remember the name, Abyssinian Baptist Church.
Oh, okay.
The church of Adam Clayton Powell.
Okay.
Was his
well, that's
church.
interesting. Since Adam Clayton Powell, we're going to have to like get into him a different time too. But would you say, I've also heard, I mean, there were other gay people at that church, weren't there?
Yeah.
I've heard that, too.
Yeah, there were.
Yeah.
I mean, the church was full of closeted queens and kings.
But it was like the girls, they were friends of your family, people in your community that were women that lived together. Yeah. Was that in Mississippi?
That was Mississippi.
Okay.
There were lots of closeted lesbians.
Do you remember their names?
I remember one. Her name was Betty Jean.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember one.
Because you talked about how, about how your grandfather, nobody would have ever been allowed to hurt them, or
Right.
there are
right.
people that were loved.
Everybody. I grew up on a street called Prosperity Street.
Wow.
There was nothing prosperous about Prosperity Street, and I was born in a house that my grandfather built. It was on 188 Luke Street.
188 Luke Street. Okay.
Yeah. And so there was Luke, James. It was all of the books in the Bible that were the names of these streets,
Wow.
And we were not particularly blessed or spiritual or any of that, but it was a very close neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And so I grew up during a time when black folks knew about black folks, but it wasn't any big deal. I mean, it wasn't any big deal. Like my mom and my grandmother never told me not to go over to Betty Jean's house, I mean, I would go over there and she would braid my hair, and she would, comfort me, it was just one of those things that people knew that it just didn't.
But you didn't call her Betty Jean, did you? Did you call Miss Betty Jean, or?
No, I called her Betty, I think.
You did? Yeah.
She was actually the first closeted lesbian that I ever made, and the first woman who ever touched me, and I didn't know what was going on, but all I knew is I liked it, and somehow it felt like I was supposed to be doing that.
Wow.
So, so growing up in the South as a child and recognizing that my feelings were different than a lot of folks, there's this one particular incident that I remember that will stay with me for a lifetime. There were, on my street was poor black people.
Mm-hmm.
On the street over from me, the name of that street was James Street. There were poor white people, but we were poor, but we still were separated. And this little kid who I met, I don't remember his name, but he was a little white boy, used to come over and we became friends, and I used to let him ride my bicycle. And he didn't have a bicycle. And I would let him ride mine, and I would put him on the back of mine, and I would ride. He would put me on the back, and we would ride. I remember my cousin, whose name was Charles Taylor, came up and knocked the kid off my bike and made him cry. And I remember jumping up and like trying to smack him, saying, "Why are you doing that? Why are you doing that?" He said, "I'm doing it to save your life. Black folks and white folks don't interact down here like that. Or
Wow.
Black folks and white folks are not friends." And I was like, "But he's my friend." And I remember this kid crying, and I remember trying to encourage him and just saying, "I'm so sorry that happened," And
Wow.
that one incident sort of stayed with me for years in terms of the cruelness of racism, both black and white.
Well, yeah.
Then my family moved from Mississippi. My grandfather and grandmother went to Saginaw, Michigan. At the time, I was getting older, and I didn't want to live with my grandparents anymore. So I wrote my mother, who was living up in New York, and my mom sent me a ticket. I remember.
I'm sure you wanted to get to New York.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember every single moment on that plane. I was in such anticipation because I had no idea how big New York was. And I thought, oh, I'll just get a cab and go to my mom's house, And I flew into Newark.
Yeah.
And I had no idea how far Newark was from Long Island.
When was the first time you went on a plane?
Probably during that time. I think it was my first time on a plane.
Yeah, so because didn't people usually take trains?
Yeah, people took trains.
So that must have been exciting too.
It was. But even the planes were segregated.
Oh, yeah.
You know, so I had to sit in the back of the plane. Women all across the country who I am in touch with understand that there are many of us who fought for the freedoms that they have today. and that it was not always an easy road to travel, but that through perseverance and developing, remember there used to be consciousness raising groups. Remember those women's?
Where a lot of them were white women.
Yeah, a lot of them were white women,
Yeah.
but there were a small group of black women who did it too. You know, and it was really around gaining more visibility for black queer people. You know, there was at one point there was a group of black men, a group of brothers called the Black Men's Network, I think, Black Men's Exchange, which was a group of black men out of Oakland who worked to have black brothers have more visibility in the LGBT movement. A guy named Joe Hawkins.
Joe Hawkins.
Yeah, he's
Live and kicking.
Yeah, he's still involved. In fact, I think he's the director of the Oakland LGBT
He
Center.
is. Yeah.
So Joe and I go back a long way as well. You know, I've known Joe for years. And so proud of the work that he's doing now.
You were just in so many movements and everything, you know, your whole life. Can you talk about what was fun about it?
Well, I think the whole thing that was fun was that we were young and we thought we could conquer the world, you know. We never...
Did you party and date? And,
oh, yeah, we partied.
I mean, what was dating like? I'm always really interested in that.
In the early days, when I first came out, I dated lots of women. And it was, you know...
Where did you meet?
Probably in one of the lesbian and gay bars that was on Long Island. There used to be a place on Long Island. I can't remember the name of it, but...
I can probably find the name.
Yeah, there was a place on Long Island that was one of the premier spots for gays and lesbians, primarily lesbians, that I used to go out there a lot. And I met a lot of women out there. And then there was a place up in Harlem that was, again, I think it was called Sylvia's. Or maybe that's a soul food restaurant. I don't know. There was a place up in Harlem. You could ask Joyce. She would know better. That was primarily a lot of black lesbians would go there. And I would go there too. But yeah, I met lots of women. The first woman that I had a relationship with, her name was Tina. And she was a barmaid in the local bar. And I remember at that time I was drinking rum and Coke. And she just kept giving me these rum and cokes, you know. And I got pretty lit. And so finally I said, no, I have to go home, man. I'm getting to the point where I'm not going to be in any condition to drive. She said, no, just sit here. You're coming home with me. And I was like, oh, okay.
So that would have been about in the 50s?
60s.
60s.
Yeah.
Do you remember how people dressed back? Was she cute?
She was cute. She was very cute. Yeah, we dressed in bell bottoms.
Bell bottoms, yeah.
So I went home with her, and then that was my first introduction, you know.
Wow.
And
you jump right in, bartender. I mean, wow.
And so we stayed together for a little while, but I never forget that the night that she had a lot of men who thought were hitting on her, because she was so attractive. She was a very cute girl. And one night I walked in and this man was trying to hit on her, and she said, I don't know what you don't get, but I'm going home with her.
What was her name?
It was Tina telling this man.
Tina, okay, her name was Tina.
Telling this man, I don't know what you don't get, but I'm going home with her. And you know, the dude jumped on me, assaulted me in the bar.
Oh my God.
Just started to wail on me, and this man, and she came out behind the bar and was hitting him with a broomstick and doing all kinds of things. And then I went home and I told my stepfather, this is the only thing my stepfather ever did that was, I think, socially redeeming. I told my stepfather that this dude had jumped on me in this bar. And my stepfather went back to the bar and pistol whipped the dude.
Oh my God. Oh, I remember you telling
Told him, don't you ever touch my daughter again.
Wow.
You
So
know,
that he did one
so that's one
redeeming
thing I can say that he did for me growing up. And the guy never touched me again. I mean, I went up, but you know, it was awful. I mean, I just walked in the bar and she said, "I don't know what you don't get. I'm going home with her." You know, and I looked, and next thing I know, this guy
Did he get 86th?
Oh yeah, he did. He did. He got banned from the bar. He got pistol whipped by my stepfather.
So
I was at Stonewall when Stonewall happened because I lived on Long Island, and I would go into Greenwich Village. So I was at the Stonewall. I wasn't at the riots, but I certainly was down in that area, and I certainly saw things that started out at Stonewall. And that also was one of the highlights of my life, to be down at a demonstration that started the LGBT movement in this country. And so came the Stonewall Democratic Club, and the Victory Fund and all those clubs. So it is an amazing thing to me to have the kind of history I have in politics, both in Vallejo and nationally. But you know, my faith came from my mom. My mother was a tremendously faithful woman. And I grew up in Long Island. I grew up in a little town called Amityville, Long Island. And my mom was a mother of the church, and my mom was incredibly faithful. And so I learned from her.